Today I'm pleased to present the second event in the Refugee Jobs Agenda and the webinar entitled From Welcoming Cities to Welcoming Economies. As never before, cities are front page news when it comes to migration, to diversity, and to inclusion. Cities have demonstrated a great capacity to respond with resilience and optimism, both to the refugee crisis and to false populist narratives of fear and exclusion. And welcoming cities are open cities. They're open to a diversity of people and ideas, and they're open for business. They're solution-seeking, entrepreneurial, and acutely aware of the challenges and, more importantly, the opportunities that migration brings. More flexible and responsive than most national governments, cities understand that when immigrants prosper, we all do. Today, welcoming cities across Europe and North America are at the forefront of a humanitarian response to the refugee crisis. And the urban agenda for refugees increasingly emphasizes jobs. So let's shift our point of view. What is a welcoming economy? If employment is the #1 priority for newcomers post-arrival, how can cities and employers work together to create a more receptive culture for refugees and make full use of their talent, their skills, and above all, their desire to succeed? We are joined today by experts in Berlin and Hamburg to help us unpack these important questions. Dan Wallace, project consultant for Welcoming America, joins us from Berlin in Germany. And Dr. Toufi El-Masri, deputy director from the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce and Migrant Firms Division, joins us from Hamburg, Germany. We'll start today's session by introducing our guest speaker, Dan Wallace. Dan is a project consultant at Welcoming America, working in Berlin, where he supports U.S.-German transatlantic exchange through the Bertelsmann Foundation. Dan has worked on integration issues in both government and non-government organizations in the United States and Germany. Dan was the former Director of State and Local Initiatives at the New American Economy, a coalition of 500 mayors and business leaders that uses economic data to advocate for immigration reform and local integration policies. Prior to that, Dan served as a policy advisor on immigrant affairs to the office of New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. We are truly delighted to have you here with us today, Dan. Welcome, and let's pass you over. The podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Kim. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Berlin. Thank you especially to Cities of Migration, Higher Immigrants, and the Bertelsmann Stiftung for hosting this webinar and for inviting me to participate. I'm also really happy to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Toufi El-Masri, who I was lucky to meet in Hamburg earlier this spring as part of another exchange facilitated by the Transatlantic Core Group with the BMW Foundation and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Again, my name is Dan Wallace, and I'm a project consultant with Welcoming America based in Germany. Today, I'll be talking about the idea of welcoming economies and what that means for refugee and migrant integration in the U.S. and German context. So first, some background on Welcoming America for those who are not familiar. Our aim is to bring together longtime residents and newcomers to build more inclusive communities where all residents can reach their full potential. We do this by connecting local leaders across our network of welcoming cities and counties to share best practices, by building the capacity of receiving communities to integrate newcomers with training, tools, and technical assistance, and to change systems in order to remove barriers to the full economic, civic, and social participation of all residents in a community. The welcoming city and county movement has grown really quickly in the United States, starting with just a handful of communities in 2009, now more than 160 communities across the country that are officially welcoming to refugees and immigrants. Thanks to a partnership with Cultural Vistas and the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, as well as the support of a number of other foundations and partners, which you can see listed here, welcoming cities and counties are now able to take part in a 3-year transatlantic exchange with German communities on the topic of integration. As we'll discuss today, there are, of course, differences between our country's experiences with migration, but many of the challenges local communities face are the same, and we've heard from participants on both sides of the Atlantic that being part of this exchange has helped challenge their thinking about integration strategies and given them new ideas to take back and implement at home. Here you can see the list of communities that have participated so far. The German cities and counties from 2017 just returned from their visit to the U.S., and the U.S. cities will be visiting Germany in November. For anyone listening who's interested in participating in 2018, applications will be open in the fall, and you can visit Cultural Vista's website for more information. It's there at the bottom. We've also been working over the past 6 months with partners at the Bertelsmann Stiftung and Ashoka to strengthen this exchange of good practice between the U.S. and Germany, as well as with the Tent Foundation to support currently 2 cities, Stuttgart and Mannheim, as they work to develop new narratives on refugee and migrant integration that emphasize shared local values. So as the basis for thinking about how a local community can become a welcoming economy, it's important to note that a welcoming community should support migrants and refugees directly, for example, with activities like language and integration courses, workforce development, support for entrepreneurs. And I should say also, when we think about welcoming economies in the context of refugee integration, we're also thinking about a comprehensive look at the entire community of newcomers. So there may be specific strategies for specific populations like refugees, international students, or undocumented immigrants, for example. But building a welcoming infrastructure should take all of these groups as well as the receiving community into account. It's really important to help longtime residents understand, contribute to, and benefit from integration. And so when we think about the receiving community, we really focus on 3 primary approaches, which are through leadership, contact, and communications. So quickly, what does that mean exactly? Really to engage trusted leaders in the community. These are people like mayors, business leaders, leaders from the faith community and civil society to help foster a positive local climate and make welcoming a top priority. The second and probably the most transformative component of this approach is to implement programs and policies that actually create space for locals and newcomers to come together, whether that's through volunteer projects, dialogue, arts and culture. I've actually been really amazed during my time in Germany at how many new civil society initiatives are designed with this goal in mind and how many volunteers in Germany have gotten engaged in that. The third thing is really to focus on communications. And so we've learned that messages that speak to unity and to shared local values can be effective in reaching people in the receiving community who may be skeptical or anxious still about refugees and migrants. The example on the right is from a campaign in Nebraska where sports, especially college football, are a big part of the local identity. So newcomer families are part of that identity as well. And local communities in our U.S. network have also used strategic communication to highlight why being a welcoming community, a welcoming economy are important to them. So in this example from the St. Louis Mosaic Project, you can see that the emphasis of this communication is on the benefits that newcomers bring to the region, on their innovation, their ideas, their talents. And this isn't only a slogan that's on the website or on a poster. This idea really runs through all of the work that's being done locally in St. Louis right now. They've developed a really impressive suite of programs that are designed to do everything from helping newcomer entrepreneurs start new businesses, whether that's on Main Street or in the high-tech sector, to also engaging local residents as professional connectors that can help refugee and migrant job seekers navigate the American workplace and hiring process. And luckily, when it comes to being a welcoming economy, St. Louis is not alone. There's actually more than 30 communities now that are members of the Welcoming Economies Global Network, which is beginning to help shift this narrative across the Midwest to show that immigrants and refugees are a source of strength for these communities and that they're bringing life back to cities that have been losing population and jobs for decades. This idea is actually built into the concept and design of the Welcoming Economies Global Network. You can see here some of the common traits of many of the member communities of this network, which are that they have declining population or slow growth, populations that are aging, decline of former economic powerhouse industries like manufacturing, In my time in Germany, I've learned that this is true not only in the Midwestern United States, but also in parts of Germany, especially Eastern Germany, that have similar challenges. And may also be coming from a starting point of having a relatively small foreign-born or migrant background population. So how do welcoming economies tackle these challenges? If you visit the We Global Network website, the link is here at the bottom of the page, you'll find a series of toolkits called Ideas That Innovate that share some examples of how communities in this network are responding and really focusing on building welcoming economies. One of the first steps that we encourage communities to take is to develop a welcoming advisory board or working group. These kinds of groups focus on strategic planning for immigrant and refugee inclusion, as well as receiving community engagement, and they include a variety of stakeholders from different sectors who all have unique perspectives, as well as assets that they bring to the table. So that includes policymakers, representatives from local agencies, maybe local foundations, NGOs, employers, healthcare providers, immigrant and refugee leaders themselves, all should be involved in the planning process. And to give you a sense of how communities can really transform into welcoming economies through this kind of process, I want to highlight a case study of Dayton, Ohio. In 2009, Dayton was facing many of the same challenges that other Rust Belt cities were facing in the U.S. after the financial crisis. The crisis obviously compounded existing problems like job and population loss, unemployment, home foreclosure, which had really been adding up over decades, but were now really acute. And so you can see here the change in Dayton's population between 1960 and 2010, a pretty significant drop-off. And if you visit Dayton during this period, you would also see an increasing number of vacant residential and commercial properties. That's something that's true of many communities across the Midwest U.S. And as I said, in Germany as well, population decline or slow growth and aging are also challenges. So local leaders in Dayton decided to come up with an idea really to revitalize the city and try to spur economic growth. So they brought together 100 leaders from different sectors of the city. They organized them into different committees focusing on topics like business and economic development, and they actually came up with nearly 30 specific recommendations to make Dayton a more welcoming community and a more welcoming economy. You can see some of those recommendations here, including a plan to create a two-way campaign on immigrant and refugee entrepreneurship, which would focus both on the needs of aspiring newcomer business owners, as well as how to showcase the benefits that such entrepreneurs are bringing to the community. So they're thinking about the refugee and migrant business owners themselves, as well as the receiving community, and how to talk to them about this change and how it's benefiting their community. Because this process started in 2011, as you can see, researchers at a US-based think tank, the New American Economy, were actually able to look before and after to see what effect this process had. So they actually found between 2009 and 2013, during this period, that Dayton's foreign-born population increased by nearly 60%, and also that more newcomers were staying in Dayton longer. They found also that this influx of newcomers was putting money into the pockets of local homeowners. It helped save about 200 manufacturing jobs, and it also led to an increase in newcomers taking the step to become U.S. citizens, a slightly higher share applying for U.S. citizenship. So you can see that more people during this period are arriving in Dayton, and as they're finding Dayton to be a more welcoming place to start a business or buy a home or just raise a family, they're also putting down roots to stay there, which I think is exactly what communities in the U.S. want and communities in Germany want as well. It was really interesting to me actually to learn that this kind of process, having some kind of advisory group or multi-stakeholder approach, is also being supported in many communities in Germany, which speaks to the really transformative power of this kind of collective impact approach. This chart shows how our partners at the Bertelsmann Stiftung think about such an approach and all the different types of organizations that must be involved for it to succeed, from business, civil society, health, right down to family, friends, and neighbors. And I really like the reminder to think about this process with the human at the center of the design. I think that can be easy to forget when you're trying to navigate, government bureaucracy and trying to put an action plan in place that we're talking about. People are really the focus of this, and they should be considered at the center of the process. Another similarity between some approaches in Germany and in the U.S. is to bring municipalities together in a network to share ideas with each other. One of the ways this is structured by Bertelsmann is through a regional approach so that cities from similar geographic areas are clustered together as they go through this process. I think this is really important because when you think about building a welcoming economy at the local level, that's also going to include actors who may actually be working at the regional level or the state level or even the federal level. The things that they do impact local communities. And so if you're improving coordination among the municipalities within the same region, you may be able to actually help some of the newer cities to this process more quickly identify how to work effectively with agencies, offices, ministries that maybe oversee sources of funding or are involved in policy development. So it's a really smart way to be sharing ideas at a regional level. I really like that. Another important aspect of a welcoming economy, of course, is to engage the corporate and private sector partners in the community, but to do so in a variety of ways. I think public-private partnerships are, of course, helpful in terms of funding, and that's often the first thing that we think of, but businesses may have other strategic assets that can be leveraged. For example, just having the participation of business leaders on an advisory group can help add credibility to the overall effort. It can also broaden the audience for sharing key messages, the audiences that business leaders may be able to reach that community leaders or city leaders may not be able to. And it can also provide access to the expertise and human capital of the employees themselves from some of these companies, whether that's in terms of support on project design or management or in a volunteer capacity, with pro bono, legal, financial, business development, and other kinds of support. So this is an example from St. Louis of all the different corporate and economic development partners that they're engaging as part of the St. Louis Mosaic Project. But certainly in Germany as well, there are many companies and chambers and other groups working together with cities. One network of those is called Wir zusammen, which means we together. So these are the integration initiatives of the German economy. This is sort of a platform that's encouraging and also highlighting many of the new integration initiatives that companies across Germany are supporting. So you can see here, this is just a small example of some of the projects around sports or mentoring or other types of support. So if you visit their website, you can see all of the different companies and projects that are involved with Wir zusammen. I think one of the biggest challenges in both the U.S. and in Germany is in terms of labor market integration. One aspect of refugee resettlement in the U.S. that I think a lot of people are surprised to learn who don't work on this issue in the U.S. is just how quickly refugees are expected to become self-sufficient. So although it's beneficial, I think, to be able to start work so quickly, to have work authorization basically right away, which is not the case in Germany and in some other countries, a consequence of this is that refugees who arrive with really high qualifications, for example, if they're doctors or engineers or other kinds of specialists, they're really quickly often placed in roles that are far below their skill and education levels, which is leads to something that a lot of people in our field are calling brain waste. So the classic example of this may be a taxi driver that you would have when you visit New York City who used to be an engineer or doctor in his or her country of origin. And so that's a huge waste, of course, to that person, but also to the local economy to be missing out on those skills. Across Germany and the U.S., there's a huge need for certain types of labor. There's shortages in STEM, in healthcare, in other sectors, so we're missing out on that talent. And then also one thing that does is, it's pushing other people who may be appropriately qualified for low or sort of middle skill or labor-intensive positions out of the opportunity to have those. So to counteract this, there's more and more economic development agencies, educational institutions, NGOs, state and local governments that are working to remove barriers for underemployed refugees and migrants so that they can work on re-entering their former fields of expertise. You can see data here from New American Economy, again, which shows that over time there is a steady increase in household income for refugees in the U.S. and actually thanks to organizations like Upwardly Global and many others that are working on this issue, sometimes the jump in income doesn't take years but can take place within a matter of months. And that may happen through soft skills training, professional networking, and other types of support that can really quickly move someone from an entry-level position into really what would be considered, I think, like a gateway job back into their former area of expertise and training. Germany, of course, faces similar challenges, as I said, for a variety of reasons, including also the difficulty of recognizing credentials that were earned in other countries. It's the case that unemployment among Germans with a migration background is roughly twice as high as among other Germans. And at the same time, Germany, like the U.S., is facing skills shortages in key areas of the labor market. So this group, the IQ Network, which is short for Integration Through Qualifications, started in 2005 to begin to address these challenges and also to bring the economic potential of refugees and migrants really into focus rather than only talking in terms of shortcomings. So you can see here on this map, which is on the IQ Network website, that there are more than 400 organizations within this network already that are offering things like qualification recognition advice, connections to companies, job centers, and employment agencies, as well as offers for individuals who are self-employed. On that note, one more aspect of welcoming economies that I'll touch on during this part of the presentation is around support for entrepreneurs. So as you can see here on the right-hand side, there are nearly 200,000 refugee entrepreneurs living in the U.S., earning a business income of nearly $5 billion. It's well established, I think, in the U.S. that immigrants in general are more likely to be entrepreneurs than the U.S.-born. But actually, if you look at the data, refugees are even more likely than immigrants overall to own their own business. And at the same time, both migrant and refugee entrepreneurs have specific challenges that local communities are working to address. In particular, finding ways to expand access to financial capital that's key to growing a business. So you can see here a couple of really interesting examples from Detroit and from Baltimore. So the example in Detroit, I think this is true in a lot of places, that there are existing grants, loan programs, and other incentives that exist to support entrepreneurs, especially in distressed neighborhoods, to support economic growth. But often there are specific barriers for migrant and refugee entrepreneurs that keep them from either knowing about these opportunities or from being able to access them. For example, there are cases where because a financial institution may not have a lot of flexibility, they may have certain credit score requirements or certain legal documentation requirements. But really, I think a big challenge is just knowing about these opportunities. So in Detroit, there was a program that provided a small stipend, just $5,000, to a connector agency so that people were able to canvass local businesses, go to community events at churches, and places where immigrant and refugee potential business owners were likely to be so that they could actually get information about this program. And during this grant period, again, it's a really small grant compared to the total amount of financing for these kinds of projects. They actually saw applications grow about 350% in the target areas. So this approach was really helpful in reaching hard-to-reach aspiring entrepreneurs. Similarly, in Baltimore, you can see here there was an existing revolving loan program, but that requires specific documentation around legal status and good credit. And often in the U.S., there's, I think, a challenge of newcomers arriving who either don't have any credit history or who have poor credit, really are just getting started with their activity in the financial sector in the U.S. And so there's a real need to be thinking about how these kinds of microloan and other program opportunities can also reach those kinds of entrepreneurs. So the city was able to provide seed funding and space to an organization called the Latino Economic Development Corporation, which has years, actually decades of experience working with immigrant entrepreneurs in Baltimore. And so they were able to have a little bit more flexibility and actually be able to offer and meet an unmet need for migrant entrepreneurs in Baltimore. So these are just some examples of creative ways of expanding what already exists in terms of support for entrepreneurs, for everyone in the community, and making sure that it's also accessible to migrants and refugees. I was really surprised to learn, actually, but I've heard this from a lot of people in Germany, that in general, the entrepreneurial or sort of startup culture is less pronounced in Germany than in other countries. I think, partly this may be due to the fact actually that Germany's labor market and apprenticeship system has worked really well, and Germans, if you look at the data, are generally among the most optimistic in terms of their economic outlook for themselves and their families in the near future. But you can see here a graph on the right from The Economist, which actually confirms that this is the case in terms of early stage entrepreneurial activity in Germany. But with the arrival of more migrants and refugees, this is beginning to change, and there's been a sharp increase in business activity among people who were born abroad or who have a migrant background. And importantly, it's not only in areas like retail or hospitality, which a lot of folks might expect. There was a recent report from the Bertelsmann Stiftung that found that actually just 28% of new migrant background businesses were in the retail and hospitality sectors, whereas a much larger share were actually in knowledge-intensive services and the manufacturing sector. So it also found that Germans with a migrant background created 1.3 million taxable jobs in Germany in 2014. So again, thinking about not only what are the needs of migrant and refugee entrepreneurs, but how can we communicate the benefits that they bring to other members of receiving communities. And you can see this change in terms of an increasing amount of entrepreneurial activity among migrants and refugees. It's reflected in the growth of this sort of ecosystem to support refugee and migrant entrepreneurs in Germany, which includes a lot of different kinds of institutions that are supporting these activities. So German IHK, or Chambers of Commerce, that are running programs, social businesses or NGOs that have programs to support entrepreneurs, as well as city-supported efforts that are helping to remove some of these typical barriers for both the newest arrivals who may be refugees or other types of migrants, as well as long-term communities with migrant background in Germany. So this is really just starting to scrape the surface of some of the different ways that welcoming economies in the U.S. and Germany are taking shape and supporting refugees, as well as benefiting the receiving community. So I'm looking forward to digging in with more questions and discussion. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you, Dan, for sharing that incredible model with us. The Welcoming Cities and Economies model is both strategic and compelling, I must say, in advancing a shared agenda for social and economic inclusion. And I understand the model has been recognized, adapted, and replicated internationally in cities across the U.S., of course, but also in Australia. And we hear that there are plans to take the model to the U.K. I was especially interested to hear about Welcoming America's deep dive and learning exchange with German cities, and we really look forward to hearing more about that experience in the months ahead. Thank you. That was really great. So it's now time to turn the conversation to our second guest, Dr. Toufi El-Masri, who is Deputy Director of Hamburg Chamber of Commerce and Head of the Chamber's Migrant Firms Division. The Hamburg Chamber of Commerce has served trade and industry in the Hanseatic city of Hamburg for over 350 years, a long time, representing some 160,000 member companies, which altogether employ over 850,000 people. In August 2015, the Hamburg Chamber established a new division on migrant firms in response to the large number of immigrant businesses in the city of Hamburg. So they were very well positioned to respond to the massive reception of some 900,000 refugees that Germany and German cities have seen since that year. Chambers of commerce like Hamburg Chamber have been among Germany's first responders to the refugee crisis, stepping up to engage local business leaders and refugee-serving agencies with advice, analysis, programming, and networking events. Dr. Toufi El-Masri is Deputy Director of the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce and Head of the Migrant Firms Division. In addition to his business acumen, Toufi and his team at the Hamburg Chamber bring invaluable cultural and linguistic competencies from their own immigrant backgrounds to enrich their daily work. Toufi himself was born in Lebanon and moved to Germany with his family when he was 7 years old. He speaks German and Arabic as a native speaker, but is also fluent in English, French, and Spanish. He studied business administration with a focus on business informatics before receiving a doctorate from Leuphana University in Lüneburg on competition in network industries. Toufi's research interests and professional experience include a dazzling range of topics, nanotechnology, network economics, health economics, includes both consulting and teaching in the areas of business process, statistics, and economics. So we are delighted to have Toufi join us today in conversation with Dan Wallace from Welcoming America. Please join me in welcoming Toufi.
Hello everyone from Hamburg, and it's a pleasure for me to be part of this webinar. So thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks also to Kim for this introduction, and of course thank you also to Dan for this great insight into his work. When I met Dan the first time in Hamburg, I realized that more than ever how important it is to exchange ideas on an international level, so we can learn a lot from each other. So it's a pleasure for me that we are having this exchange right now. I prepared a few questions for Dan, but let me please first give you a quick introduction into our activities as a chamber. You all know that thousands of refugees from Syria, Iraq, and other countries have been granted asylum in Germany since 2015. These people arrived in Germany in a period of economic prosperity and with growing concerns of companies unable to find employees for their job vacancies. And our Chamber of Commerce has responded to this challenge with a 6-point plan for refugee integration into the vocational training and work, which mainly include, I'm going to mention only a few of these points. For example, inform companies. So as a chamber, we have our members, and these members are the companies. So we support them, and we, for example, produce 2 guidelines to inform them about legal hurdles, because there are a lot of regulations here which must be considered. And another guideline, for example, dealt with cultural issues, as we know that people are coming from completely different cultures, and many firms don't know so much about these cultures and maybe are kind of afraid or so. So we informed our companies, our members, and for example, we also conducted information events or had other activities to facilitate employment. For example, we had a very big project called Marketplaces for Encounter. This was just like a job fair where companies met refugees, and so they got in contact, and some of them actually were hired. So we were very happy about that. Our other examples are the assessment of competencies. We all know that when people escape their countries, they don't have to take their document with them. But many of these people, and we heard that also in the presentation of Dan, are very skilled. They had very good jobs. They were, for example, doctors or had other good jobs, but they don't have documents. And so we have a project to assess these competencies so that they can continue where they stopped in their home countries. And we have also other things where we support, for example, with job applications, because the application in Germany is a very structured process. The CV is very central here in Germany for the application, and this is something where we supported refugees. And a very one last thing, very important also, is that we support self-employment. And this is actually what our division here does in the Chamber of Commerce, which we established in 2015 as Kim introduced. We support the self-employment and have different activities, events, and consultation and meetings where we can support Mike to go into the questions to them. So then again, thank you very much for this great insight. We heard that the Welcoming Cities model is well defined in the United States and very appealing to many cities. However, many cities, especially in Germany, have a long history of migration and also have well-developed frameworks for integration that have been very successful. Now I would like to start with 3 questions. The first one is, what are some of the differences in approach you have observed? We heard already a little bit on that in your presentation. The second question is, what are the biggest challenges to adapting the Welcoming Cities framework outside the United States? As we know, there are differences between these countries. And my third question is, what have you learned from German models that can enrich the U.S. approach?
Great. Thank you very much. Those are really interesting questions and important ones for all of us to be grappling with. I would say as far as differences, for one thing, I think the federal government in Germany is much more involved in this process. So there are structures like the Interior Ministry, the Chancellery, the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, which are actually supporting and funding, in some cases, integration projects at the local level, especially new pilot initiatives and ideas, in addition to all the other support, both structural and financial support, that was mobilized to respond to the arrival of so many refugees. So I think that kind of public sector commitment and financial support from the federal level is missing in the U.S., and I think that that's something that is not only true, that's not a new phenomenon now, I think that's been true for a long time. So that's I think one difference that sort of runs through every level of government is the public sector involvement. I think as a result of that, so the U.S. approach is a little bit maybe more grassroots. There's a network of a lot of NGOs that have really decades of experience in refugee resettlement and community organizing and advocacy and integration, and also that many of these organizations are led by migrants and refugees themselves. So many people I've spoken to in Germany recognize, I think, that migrants and refugees should have a bigger presence at the decision-making table, and that coordination with civil society and the public sector can also be improved. On the other hand, I think you're completely right that a lot of German cities are more likely to already have plans in place or to have long-standing integration concepts. For example, the city of Münster, which I was lucky to be able to visit, they had an elected advisory board for foreigners back in 1984. They had a coordination office on integration in 1999. They had a migration concept passed by the city council in 2008. So if you're comparing with U.S. cities, maybe New York City, maybe 1 or 2 other places in the U.S. were working on that kind of time frame. But I think for the most part, the innovation and the expansion of this sort of municipal approach is really a recent phenomenon in the U.S., whereas I think in German communities there's a long history of that. As far as challenges to adapting this framework, I think one thing that is somewhat new in Germany is really the focus on the receiving community. I do think that Germany really showed the rest of the world what it looks like when people step up to volunteer, to welcome newcomers. That was super inspiring for me and for a lot of people in the U.S. to see. At the same time, I think there are a lot of people in Germany, and you see this in the context of the election and in other ways, who they're not part of the most supportive group, and they're also not part of the most opposed parts of society, for example, with right-wing parties in Germany. But there's a group of people, and it's important to remember there are people in the middle between the most supportive and the least supportive who are still somewhat conflicted about this issue and about the role of Germany and of their local communities in taking in refugees and migrants and supporting integration. And so I think it's important for local communities to really focus on this, even as they focus on the needs for arriving refugees and migrants. I think if you're not implementing strategies that bring the receiving community along with you, then you're going to risk alienating some people who actually could have been supportive, and I think we saw that happen in the U.S. Along those lines, I think one extension of that is the idea of strategic communication. That's also quite new in Germany. There are not as many organizations working on this. There are a handful that I have met with here that are beginning to coordinate more and more, but I think a lot of them actually are international organizations that don't have strong roots in Germany yet. And so I think figuring out a German approach to integrating communication and positive narratives about refugees into all the other great work that's happening is really an important piece to still work on. And then as far as learning from German models, I mean, there are so many impressive things happening, especially at the local level. I've met with a lot of people from different chambers of commerce across Germany who are taking a really active role in labor market integration and support for refugee and migrant entrepreneurs, which is also to why I thought to include you on this webinar. I mean, certainly U.S. chambers are a really strong voice on immigration from an advocacy perspective, but it's less common to find chambers who are staffing and running programs to support migrants and refugees directly. We're trying to change that, and more chambers are joining the Welcoming Economies Global Network, for example, but I think it's an important thing to note, the really sort of granular role that chambers are playing in Germany on this issue right now. Another thing that I've been really impressed by in Germany is the ability to make quality temporary housing available to refugees. This hasn't been done equally well in every community, and of course it remains a tremendous challenge, but there are some really great examples where housing was not only built relatively quickly, but it's also really high quality. And there's examples where students or other members of the receiving community wanted to live or were living in the same buildings or on the same sites as refugee families, so that they're actually interacting throughout the day, during meals, during specific events. So that was really inspiring sort of example of intergroup contact that comes out of a more a bigger investment in housing. And then quickly last, one other area I think is really on measurement and evaluation, both from the cities themselves, for example, in setting specific goals related to something like diversity within the city's workforce, and then actually measuring that and notifying the public when those goals are not met, as well as from foundations like Bertelsmann and others who are using a lot of different research methods, including surveys, to understand things like social cohesion at the local level or welcome culture. There's a lot of research organizations in the U.S. working on this topic, but it's really more of a focus on hard numbers and economic contributions, and less on understanding how immigrants and refugees are perceived by society, and whether certain strategies aimed at promoting social cohesion are working. So we do have a lot to learn, certainly.
Okay, thank you very much. We have many good approaches here in Germany, but of course many problems are still unsolved, and many of these problems actually also relate to self-employment. So how can we better support self-employment, for example? How can we support the funding of these firms, especially if refugees have only limited residence permits. So there are many problems where many stakeholders are involved, and we are working on this. But thank you very much for your answer. Let me now go to my second question to you. The Welcoming Economies makes a strong economic case for welcoming refugees into our cities, businesses, and workplaces. What are the dangers of relying on the economic argument or a single narrative for welcoming refugees?
Yeah, great question. I would say it's definitely not a good idea to rely only on a single narrative, and that at Welcoming America we completely agree that the economic narrative is just one among many that may work for different audiences. Really, above all, refugees and migrants are people, they're full members of our communities, they're not just workers, they're not just taxpayers. And I think in Germany in particular, a lot of the emphasis so far has been on the need for a humanitarian response to welcoming refugees rather than on an economic response. I think at the same time, the economic frame can help people see beyond the images that typically may come to mind when someone is talking about refugees or refugee resettlement. This is something I mentioned that the IQ network is talking about as well, not just to talk about the needs people have or the difficult circumstances that they've experienced, but also what can they contribute, what are they able to contribute when they can reach their full potential, when they're able to fully participate, and when we remove barriers to their participation. So I think the really important thing to remember is that different messages are going to resonate with different audiences. There's some really interesting research being done on this now in Germany in terms of segmentation of society and attitudes towards migrants and refugees. Similar to the US, there's roughly about 60% of people in society who fall somewhere in the middle between the most supportive and the most opposed. But then if you look within that 60%, what we would call the conflicted middle or the anxious middle, there's also differences there. So some people in that middle group are already pretty convinced that refugees and migrants are good for the German economy. Others see it from a humanitarian perspective, but both groups remain somewhat skeptical that newcomers will successfully integrate. So responding to that skepticism, I think, with examples of successful integration, as well as narratives that speak to what people have in common. So their shared values, for example, as a resident of Stuttgart or Mannheim or any other city, it can help people see themselves in refugees and migrants. So really, I agree, it's not enough to just be saying refugees are good for you or good for our economy, but to say refugees are you and here's what we have in common. So I think using a variety of messages for different audiences.
Yeah, that's good, and I think it's also very important to if you have, of course, you have also people who have criticism about all this topic. It's important that we hold a constructive dialogues on this, and that we provide also a platform for exchange for everyone, you know, where everyone can participate and ask questions and get answers maybe. Thank you. Okay, next question I have to you is, we know that labor market integration, it's not that easy. It is a complex task with various challenges for all parties involved. So in your opinion, what are the most crucial steps, the secret formula for successful labor market integration? I presented at the beginning our 6-point plan. It was just some of all our activities, and we did so many different things just for one purpose, for this labor market integration and to support this hiring of refugees. So this issue is linked to many hurdles. So what hurdles do employers especially face, and what hurdles do refugees face? Tell us about your experience.
Yep. So I think that there's not maybe a one-size-fits-all approach on this. I agree that it's a really big challenge. I think one of the biggest ways that this process can be improved at a systemic level, and so not just one program, not just one agency that's changing a policy, is really to bring together all the local stakeholders involved in the process to figure out how to get rid of some of these really common silos where agencies aren't talking to each other, where agencies don't know about, for example, NGOs that they could be working with to identify talent for employees in the community. So really to bring everyone together and look for opportunities to streamline access to these programs and to remove barriers. I think one of the things we've also seen that's even relatively low cost can be really effective. For example, tapping a company's employees to volunteer to have a coffee with a refugee job seeker and then introduce that person to more people in their network. This is a program that's taking place in St. Louis, in Detroit. I know it was, I think, modeled actually after a similar program in Canada. This can have a huge impact. I mean, it's obvious when you think about it, but when you move to a new country, one thing that you lack right away is access to the professional network you had before. So building that back up is a big component that doesn't really require a huge policy shift or a huge investment of financial resources, and can tap the energy of, like we've seen in Germany and other places, so many committed volunteers. In terms of hurdles, one thing I've heard a lot in both the US and Germany is that you have a lot of employers and companies who are really eager to step up, especially at the beginning. I think, of course, that's really important. Leadership does matter, and you want that leadership, again, coming not only from leaders in government, from business as well. But then the challenge is that they actually have to really think about how they operate, and the fact that it's not just about the refugee job seeker or the migrant job seeker who has to change maybe their resume or get some new training or something. It's also the employer who has to change. So many bigger companies have really well-defined HR processes that have worked for them for a long time and help them find talent, and sometimes those processes are difficult to change, but they may not be working so well for new kinds of candidates. And then also, I mean, some of the mid-sized and especially smaller companies, a different challenge may be that they actually lack the internal support from, whether that's from human resources or legal or operations, to navigate the process of hiring a refugee or an international student or another kind of newcomer, even when there's a commitment from the top to be doing so. In St. Louis, one creative way that they're working around this is actually to partner with a local chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association to help provide pro bono legal support to businesses that want to hire people with an international background but don't maybe have the in-house legal team to do so. So I think there's a variety of challenges and hurdles, but I think there are some good models both in the U.S. and Germany for addressing this, and I think it's really crucial to overall success for someone to feel that they're able to contribute and that they're able to provide for their family and that they're able to take an active part in the economy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can just add from our perspective, when we as a chamber decided to support this, the first thing we did was to conduct a questionnaire. We asked our member firms, are you willing to hire refugees? And almost 80% of the respondents said yes, they were willing to hire refugees, and we were very happy about this issue. This is maybe also because Hamburg, the city of Hamburg, has a long tradition of migration, and we have people from 180 nations living here in Hamburg, so it's maybe kind of a different view on this issue. But we were very happy about that firms, our member firms, were willing to hire them, but we also knew they need a lot of support, especially, and this is the most crucial issue with this, is the language. This is one of the most crucial issues where we need the support, and we need even more support. We are not there where we could be now. Okay, thank you. And then let's go to my last question to them. We already heard many refugees go into self-employment, and in Germany, for example, about 44% of newly registered businesses in 2015 were founded by people with foreign passports. You also presented this figure in your presentation. So almost each second firm founded is founded by refugees or by migrants. But of course, we also have hurdles in this regarding this issue. And I would like now to have your opinion. What hurdles do you see in this regard, and how can we promote more successful outcomes in refugee and immigrant entrepreneurship?
Yep, and I'll answer this one quickly. I know we'll have some really interesting questions from the audience as well. So definitely in the U.S., there's really wide recognition that migrants and refugees are more likely to be entrepreneurs. You shared data, and we've seen a lot of data also from Germany. This is increasingly the case. But I think one thing that we also see is that they may be more likely to actually close their businesses more quickly, or to last for a year or for 3 years, but to really have a higher business failure rate within the first 5 years. I think this happens a lot of times because maybe when they're starting, they're able to rely on family or personal financial resources, but to actually grow and get to the next stage, they need financial capital from banks and elsewhere to help them really expand their operations. And so again, I think you have to think about the receiving community institution here. So often these financial institutions aren't set up to make really small loans, or they have trouble lending to newcomers who don't have established credit history or whose legal status in the country is not as clear. So I think finding ways to help both the lenders as well as the broader ecosystem change where they can. And then, the example I shared from Detroit of helping people just know what's already out there and helping them navigate the process. One of our friend organizations, Zinga Deutschland, has a great business incubator now for newcomer entrepreneurs, where they spend a lot of time figuring out what are the different needs that folks have in terms of legal hurdles to starting a business, business model support, access to financial resources as well. So figuring out who in the community has access to those networks, as well as finding mentors, both from maybe from chambers or from other well-established small businesses, as well as other migrant and refugee entrepreneurs themselves who can provide mentorship to newcomers and help them figure out, how to navigate the process of doing this. So I think there's a lot of great examples there also.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both, Dan and Tufi, for that brilliant exchange of ideas and good practices. That lively conversation is much for us all to learn from. But we have now concluded the formal portion of today's webinar, and it's time for our audience Q&A, where I have a number of questions. So we are going to extend the webinar time a little bit to see whether we can get to some of those questions. And I think, so everyone, please continue to submit questions to the Q&A, and we'll just see how far we can get. So to continue on the theme of immigrant entrepreneurship, or self-employment, I have a question from Sarah Bapagus, who writes from Germany, and she says, with regards to entrepreneurship, in Germany where there is general skepticism about self-employment, especially among refugees, she says, but the labor market is very rigid, so self-employment is often the best option. Her question is, what are, in your experience, how do you go about getting support from communities for refugees seeking self-employment as opposed to dependent employment? So I guess the question is, how are local communities in Germany and in the U.S. Supporting refugee self-employment? And so maybe I'll turn that to you, Dan, and then invite Tufi to respond as well.
Sure. So that's a really good question, and that's something I've heard a lot about, the rigidity of the labor market system. And also I heard from some local cities that I met with that it's true also that there may not be really like a strong public concept of the idea of migrant and refugee entrepreneurship. So how can you help also the receiving community understand that this is important and it's beneficial for the economy? Again, I know I've mentioned St. Louis a few times, but as they have, I think, a really strong focus on this sort of area around innovation and entrepreneurship, one thing that they have set a goal every year is to have 200 stories about the work that they're doing in St. Louis with this community. So that can be on the local news, that can be in a blog post, that can be an op-ed or editorial. You saw also all the number of different business leaders who are involved with the project there who can be tapped to do things like write a piece that would have a pretty wide viewership. So really driving that message home again and again, and really highlighting within that stories of newcomer businesses and how they're benefiting the community. So I think it's both a story approach, and then in the U.S. also there's a lot of research highlighting the different kinds of businesses that migrants and refugees are starting and how they're adding value in the community. So I'll stop there and maybe turn it over to you.
That's great. So using research, using the facts, but also making sure you've got smart communications tactics, engaging the role of media, et cetera, to help you tell your story. That's great. And how about you, Tufi? What would you like to add?
What I would like to add is how we actually work in the Chamber of Commerce. What we do is we work very closely with migrant organizations here in Hamburg. We have some, 3 or 4, who are very actively. We have a little bit more, but the others are not that much active. But we work very closely with them, so this is very helpful, and I can only recommend, because we need the access to this group. We need to get known, and so this could be very helpful. This is one thing. So we receive a lot of support from our network, and what we also do is that we work very closely together with existing migrant firms, and this is actually what we want to extend more in the future.
Very good. Well, and I have now a question from Ri Ota from the International Organization for Migration, who takes a very different tactic, and she directs this question to you, Tufi, asking, she says, many businesses that purport to support and employ refugees actually only provide internships or short-term contracts. So she wants to know, how can the Chambers of Commerce encourage companies to hire refugees as full-time regular staff? So maybe we can start with you, Tufi, and then ask Dan to respond as well.
Yeah,
how can the chambers encourage more full-time regular employment?
Yeah, we encourage our member firms a lot with different activities from the beginning. What we, for example, did is that we had a campaign. So just to show them it's good to be active here, to hire refugees. And it's just like an image campaign. And so we showed our member firms, this is a chance. Of course, we have chances and risks linked to this issue, but what the outcome depends on what we do. And so this image campaign was for this issue, to support this. Of course, it's not. We must also consider that it's for companies not that easy, because there are different hurdles, and so if you want to hire a refugee, or to encourage companies to hire refugees as a full-time regular staff, you can do that, but you must. We know that this is at the beginning linked to costs. In many cases, you need a special support, and especially small firms cannot provide this. So what we do is that we provide some kind of support. We provide information. This is how we can support especially small and medium-sized firms. And but it's, in my opinion, it's kind of different. We always speak about refugees, but we must consider that these people, they are very different. We have among them people who can be integrated very quickly because they are extremely skilled. They are very skilled. They speak different languages. And these refugees can be hired as a full-time regular staff. But on the other hand, we have also refugees who have language problems and so on. And so it depends always. You must be honest to your member firms as a chamber and communicate. You must speak about the chances, but also about the hurdles we already today talked about. So what we do is we can make an image campaign. We can show them it's good. They are from a completely different culture, but they have not only problems because of their because having escaped from a war and so on, but they have also skills, and these skills are very very valuable, you know.
That's very good. Dan, did you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, just very quickly, I would say that I think a lot of the organizations working in the U.S. on this, so this would include chambers, but also NGOs like Upwardly Global, which I mentioned before, as well as organizations that have just been doing refugee resettlement for a long time. I think in terms of successful retention of employees, these organizations think about not only what do they have to do to prepare the refugee or migrant for the new workplace, but that they actually expect and build into their programming that they will also be advising the employers themselves. So this is going to be a process of learning from both sides, and that they actually have sort of on the front end, training about what to expect, but then also the support doesn't cut off right when the match is made, so that this is a process where both sides can learn from each other and have ongoing support to increase the rate of retention of new staff members who may be a new kind of employee for the company.
Okay, very good. I have another question here from Farima Afak. I think Tufi has already partially answered this question, so we'll just get a quick answer from both of you. Farima would like to know, based on your observations, what factors, if any, make immigrants successful entrepreneurs in the country they migrate to compared to the domestic residents of that country. So compared to the receiving community, are immigrant entrepreneurs any more successful? And if they are, what might be some of the contributing factors?
Mm-hmm.
Dan, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I have some ideas about that. I think there's probably better research on this than what I'm thinking of, which is maybe a little bit based on research and a little anecdotal. But I would say, from my perspective, I think if you're coming into a new market, one thing that I hear, which I've seen in research in terms of, there's some data that's really interesting around exports to countries where migrants are coming from, but just in general, sort of the knowledge of markets, so the knowledge of a new market in a community, what a growing community in an area may demand or have, an interest in, as well as opportunities for linking with markets in other countries. So I think there's a new perspective that you bring in that may help you see opportunities more quickly. I think one flip side of this is that while we always are kind of championing and cheering on this idea of higher rates of entrepreneurship among the foreign-born, among refugees or immigrants, I think in some cases this also is a product, kind of as was alluded to earlier, of the fact that it can be quite difficult to get into the labor market in some cases. And so maybe the best option quickly is to do something that's more around self-employment or kind of a startup idea. So I think those are kind of flip sides where you may see more opportunities, but there also may be some limitations that are why you're more likely to go into your own kind of venture.
That's great. So Tusi, you already mentioned that many refugees are high-skilled, speak many languages. Were there any other points that jumped to mind about what might help immigrant entrepreneurs be more successful than their native peers?
Yeah, first, I agree fully with Dan. I think, of course, we have general success factors. These are factors which are crucial for everyone, not only for refugees, but everyone. So they must be they must have the skills of everyone should bring with when he or she wants to start a business. We said language skills is important here in Germany, and the knowledge of the system in Germany. We have a little bit of bureaucracy here, and founding is a process in Germany. So it's a process with different steps, and many refugees don't think of founding of a process, and this is what we always should explain them. Of course, financial support is very crucial because many don't have money, and this is still an unsolved problem. So how can we help? Because banks, especially if someone, we mentioned already this point, especially if someone has just a limited residence permit, but the bank and requires from the bank a loan for 10 years, So it's how can we solve it? And there must be risk taking. This is normal, but we already heard that many migrants found in Germany much more than Germans, and so they have some of these required factors of skills.
Oh, very good. No, I think access to credit is a challenge that increasingly we're seeing, not just some of our financial institutions, but also some of our cities taking on. I have one or two very last questions. One from Andreas Hieronymus, who is with Open Society Foundations in London. And he asks, does the model work, the welcoming cities, welcoming economies work, does the model work as well in countries which have less favorable economic conditions, such as Greece or Italy? Are there some basics which need to be present to make it a success? So Dan, that's really a question for you. What do you think?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, I don't have as much experience in Greece or Italy as far as the replicability of the model. I mean, I would say that the challenges, I think, are really common in really in most countries. And I think this is something that I've seen from my time in Germany as well as in the U.S., that when you have an area that's going through rapid demographic change, that if you don't focus on the sort of engagement of the receiving community in that process, then you're going to leave people behind and you're going to have growing resentment and growing fear and anxiety. So I think it's really important to consider not only the needs specifically of refugees and migrants coming into an area, but really the receiving community and their role in that process. And so I think that that is certainly something that would be a crucial element of this model in any place. I would also say that from the perspective of the different strategies for reaching the receiving community, I mean, I think leadership is really important. So being able to have someone who sees this as really a priority at the head of the administration, for example, I think makes a huge difference. In places where you don't have that leadership, it can be really difficult to get things done. And in places where you do have that leadership, it can really change the game. I was lucky enough to get to visit the city of Bautzen in Germany, which has a new mayor who has spoken really highly and positively of refugees in his campaign and was able to win and is now, I think, helping to set a more positive tone in that community. So I think really thinking about if you need leadership, what can you do to make it possible for leaders to, stand out and actually say and take a positive stance? So who else in the community would need to stand with them? So that's, I think, why we also think about faith leaders, business leaders, community leaders who can be standing with the mayor so that the mayor doesn't have to stand alone in making this commitment. But I do think leadership is really crucial and receiving community engagement is really crucial regardless of where you're working.
Whatever the economic conditions, maybe even more so when the economic conditions are challenging, in fact. Well, that's a great answer. And on the question of leadership, I'm going to go to one of our two last questions. I have a question from Peter Cook, and he wants to know, he says, if a mayor of a city is not on board with the idea of economic integration, is not pro-immigration reform, what can be done to get the city government on board? It's a great question for the economist and the advocate alike. What do you do when in the absence of mayoral leadership to move an agenda like this forward? Maybe Dan, we can start with you, but then Tufi, I'm sure you have ideas too.
Yep. So I would say a couple of things to that. One is sort of what I started to say at the end of the last question, which is thinking about who, for example, who does the mayor need to hear from? Who would the mayor need to be standing with in order to feel more comfortable taking a positive position? And how often can the mayor hear from those folks? And how publicly do you want to do that? So are there supportive business leaders? Are there other community leaders who can be getting that message out so that the mayor sees it, so that that's starting to help shift attitudes? I think really the key piece that can be done, certainly without leadership from the top, is really to think about contact building strategies. There's a lot of research showing that people who don't know someone who's a migrant or a refugee are more likely to view immigration as a threat, whereas people who do know someone who's in their network who is a migrant or a refugee are more likely to view immigration positively. So creating opportunities for people to have a positive interaction, even if that's not related to an immigration project, it could be something like a neighborhood beautification project, working in a school or a community garden. These activities can take place with volunteers. They can take place without, I think, the support of the administration. Of course, it's helpful if you have that as well. But those opportunities where people can meet each other in a positive setting and get to know one another and really see that they have more in common than they have differently can help change attitudes. And I think that's why in a lot of places where the foreign-born population is smaller, you see more of a negative response because there are fewer of those interactions happening. And as you reach sort of a point where there's maybe like a critical mass of people and an opportunity for more of those kinds of engagement, then you start to get there, you start to shift attitudes. But in the meantime, you can have a strategy to work at the neighborhood level, at the very local level, to bring more people together. And I think that really is what can help change the underlying conditions in a community, which may then make it easier for administration to come on board.
Hmm. Very good. And how about Tufi? Do you have a strategy to offer us for getting mayors on board?
Yeah. First of all, we are very lucky in Hamburg because our mayor is very supportive. So we don't have this problem here. But in my opinion, the mayor should represent everyone in the city. So of course, he must provide, or some other people must provide, the platform to exchange, to speak to the critics, and in this case, the mayor is one of the critics, and to speak about that. So we need the platform. This is so important for everyone in any case, and we also in Hamburg needed this platform, although our mayor was supportive, but there were, of course, other people who weren't that supportive, who had more criticism on this issue, and we provided the platform so that they can tell about their fears and that they can express their criticism and maybe also exchange. So the only thing in this case you can do is try to convince, and to maybe to show, okay, the refugees are here per law. They are allowed to come here in Germany. I'm speaking about Germany, and to stay in Germany. And we all know we have chances and risks linked to this issue. And what gets realized, or the outcome of this, and I already said this before, is it depends on us, you know. Mm-hmm. And so we need, in this case, the platform to speak about that and to speak to the critics, and to maybe we can convince the mayor in this case. I know in some cases it's very hard because of the political background of some people, but we at least need the platform to talk about it.
Very, very good. And one very last question. This one for Dan, who obviously from Peter Cook, who's obviously been very impressed at what we've heard about the potential of chambers of commerce to work with city stakeholders on an immigration integration agenda. Peter Cook says, how critical is getting the help of chambers of commerce in the U.S.? So, Dan, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be really powerful to have a strong ally in the Chamber of Commerce. That's something that I was working on at New American Economy. It's something that the We Global Network is working on. I think there's a natural fit in terms of priorities for chambers and priorities of a welcoming movement. I mean, those are that diverse communities are more likely to be have better outcomes for everyone in terms of income. They're more likely to attract the talent that a lot of these chambers and their members are seeking. I think chambers have a really good understanding of the pressure points for the employers in the area in terms of where there may be skills or gaps in their workforce. So chambers have this sort of bird's eye view of what needs to be happening for the local economy. And then because, I mean, in a lot of cases, I would say chambers are really powerful political allies to have. And because often, you know, the business community may not be seen in such partisan terms, that you can have more of a broader coalition politically if you have the chamber on board as well. That can really make a difference when you're talking about a mayor who may be somewhat supportive but not totally ready to come out and say so really publicly. But if the chamber is going to be standing with them, that gives them a lot of credibility. It helps them reach, you know, a new audience, and it can give them sort of the room to be more out front on this issue, I would say. So there's all of these sort of advocacy and persuasion and just sort of access and network that chambers have. And then they also, I think, as you've seen from the example with TUPI as well as with other chambers around Germany and in the U.S., that they have the ability to really have some important roles in terms of programming around mentorship, around labor market integration, around support for entrepreneurs because of the resources that they have. So they can play a huge role. I think it's really critical to get them involved.
Yeah. So that's an exciting note to end on. We've, to hear about really the centrality of a stakeholder that maybe we don't understand quite as well as we ought to here in North America. Tufi, in Germany, would it be is it possible to imagine moving an integration agenda forward without a role for chambers of commerce?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
So chambers of commerce, would you say they are a typical stakeholder in conversations around immigrant integration, or an unusual actor?
Definitely, because integration, I said this already, is a complex task, and we have different forms of integration. And I think the best form to integrate people into the society is to integrate them first into the labor market. And what we as a chamber can do very well, I think, is to support our member firms, because as a chamber we have good contact, we are on a regular basis communicating with our member firms, and they are hiring at the very end. So chambers could play everywhere a very good role because of this good contact to firms. Did I answer your question? Or?
That does, absolutely. Thank you. And I think we have come now to the end of our Q&A. I would like to ask each of you one very last, very simple question as we conclude this wonderful session about moving from welcoming communities to welcoming economies. If you had to choose one word to describe the secret to your success, what would that be? Dan, let's start with you. In a word?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I would say contact really is the key thing.
Contact
between newcomers and locals. Yep.
Yeah, bringing people together. And how about you, Tufi? Is there a single word that sums up the secret to your success?
Single word. I think you need in Germany you need a German surrounding. So you need German friends, and you need contact to the community. I think this is not one word.
That's great.
I'm saying it because me myself came from another country, and I think I'm very well integrated in Germany, and school and so on. Everything is very important, but I think the most important thing was that I always had German friends. Helped me. This was so important to me, and this is why I would like to share this now at this moment.
Well, very good. So building bridges, contact building strategies, bringing receiving communities together with our newcomer communities. What a great way to end the session. I'd like to thank you both. Our time has run out. On behalf of all of our participants and the team here at Cities of Migration at the Global Diversity Exchange, let me thank guests Dan Wallace and Tufi El-Masri for a brilliant exchange of ideas and conversation. To our audiences in cities everywhere, I'd like you to imagine this excellent work being interpreted in your city, adapted by your organization, or changing your neighborhood. We'd like to hear your stories and share more good practice, so please stay connected.